and gentlemen, how you doing? This is Artie the Cigar Guy here with you again on Smoke Signals. Today, no guest, it's just me, and I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite topics. That's right, Cohiba, the cigar company, okay? We're going to talk about the origins, we're going to talk about the history, and we're going to talk about where they are now. So stay tuned here on City World Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, here we are. I'm back. And like I said, no guest today. I did have a guest lined up, but unfortunately things happen. This is New York City, and you can't always expect to get what you want, right? But what that made me do is it made me dip into some of my records, and I pulled out some information, a script that I actually wrote a while ago for a video I wanted to do but never got around to. So I thought, hey, you know what? Today I'm gonna pull out that script, more like bullet points, but and we're gonna do a live show, beginning to end. One take, okay? And we're going to talk about Cohiba. Now, specifically, I'm talking about the Cuban Cohiba, obviously. It's one of my favorite companies. Actually, it's one of the most well-known cigar brands in the world. If you speak to somebody who doesn't really know anything about cigars, most likely they'll know the name Cohiba. And but there's actually a lot of really interesting history when it comes to Cohiba, so I really wanted to go over some of that. And I guess, I think the best place to begin would be from a direct quote from Fidel Castro himself, okay? So I used to see a man smoking a very aromatic, very nice cigar, and I asked him what brand he was smoking. He told me that it was a special blend and that it came from a friend who makes cigars, and he gave them to him. I said, let's find this man, I being Fidel Castro. I tried the cigar, and I found it so good that we got in touch with him and asked him how he made it. Then we set up the house being the El Higuita factory, and he explained the blend and tobacco that he used. He told us which leaves he used and which tobacco plantations. He also told us about the wrappers he used and other things like that. And so we found a group of cigar makers. We gave them the materials, and this is how the factory was founded. Now, Cohiba is known all over the world. And that's actually a direct quote from Fidel Castro when he was doing a 1994 interview with Cigar Aficionado magazine. Now, so what does that quote tell us? So pretty much Castro's chilling in his mansion. He sees one of his guards smoking a cigar. He's like, where'd you get that? And the guy's like, I know a guy that rolls some fumas. Now, a fuma is a Tresador. Tresador is a cigar roller, and the fuma is his personal cigar. So it's not what he makes for work. It's not what it's when he takes his own tobacco from different farms and rolls his own personal stock. So it's actually pretty hard to find. They're usually rolled with a pigtail at the end, because caps are actually just a scam perpetrated by cigar companies to sell more cutters. So they would just pigtail the end of it, and there you go. You had the fuma. So the first actual Cohiba was this fuma rolled by this gentleman. Now, this gentleman's name was Eduardo Rivera. And Eduardo was not the actual guy that ran the factory. Obviously, he put somebody else in charge, but he was one of the main blenders on the floor. So he's the one that can be accredited to pretty much creating the first Cohibas. Now, the first main production Cohiba that was produced when they started pumping them out in 1966 was actually the Panatella size. So that was the first size that they made. Now, Castro was actually very into smoking thinner cigars. So the Panatella was perfect for him. And when they pumped them out, originally it was almost like a side project. The La Higuita factory was this giant mansion that they repossessed. I could literally do a whole nother hour just about the La Higuita factory itself. It has a very, very rich history, okay? And so pretty much what they did is they just made the factory, and then they pumped out maybe a couple of 1,000 cigars a year, which if you know anything about the production of cigars, this is nothing, a blip on the radar, maybe several thousand. And mostly these cigars were either for Castro himself, his close confederates, or other, companies that pretty much, companies, I meant countries, like other presidents and heads of state would actually get these Cohibas, these early Cohibas, just for them. And this actually lasted for quite a while. So when we're looking at 1966, that was the first year that they started mass producing Lanceros for the market, okay? The first size that they started mass producing was actually the Lancero, and this was the first Lancero that was being pumped out by any company at the time. It was a 7.5 by 38, and it did have that signature pigtail that he got from the first Fumas that he smoked, okay? So, long story short, it took about another 2 years after 1966 for the government of Cuba, which is communist, to actually create the Cohiba brand. Now, where did they get the name Cohiba from? I have spoken about this before, but I do want to just remind some of our first-time listeners that the name Cohiba is actually the Taino word for tobacco, and Taino is actually a Native American indigenous peoples that lived in the area. So that's where they got the name Cohiba from. And if you guys listened to actually last week's episode with I Post Alone, you'll also know that one of their most popular cigars, the Bejique, actually also means like a shaman that used to perform the tobacco ritual. So that's really interesting. They do take a lot of their names from these Taino words. It's quite cool. So, like I said, after the brand was created, they did start pumping out different sizes, but they weren't able to pump out that many sizes, that many cigars, because they were still only giving them out to certain dignitaries. The Cohiba factory was just kind of there to supply, as much as Castro wanted them to. So there was never really that much overworking on the as far as getting the tobacco and all that. They only used the most premium stuff that Cohiba had to offer. So this went on for, I would say, about decade and a half. So the main production of Cohiba cigars for the masses wasn't actually actualized until 1982. Okay, so if we skip forward about like I said, a decade, a bit more, what you're gonna see is that now we actually have Cohiba mass producing the cigars, and what they did is they actually lined this up with the 1982 World Cup that was being held in Spain. So they kind of like made it like a big event. Cohiba releasing these new cigars, and then you have the World Cup in Spain. So they kind of made it like a huge event. And when they produced these 3 cigars, they had 3 sizes. They were the Laguita 1, 2, and 3 respectively, and that's the Panatella, right? The Corona Especial, or the Grand Panatella, and the Lancero. So those are what they pumped out in 1982 when they first started mass producing them. Okay, and as I said, they did call them the Laguita 1, 2, and 3 just because that was the original name before Cohiba was actually a company. That's what they would call the cigars that they would pump out, the Laguitas. Okay, so then several years later, okay, in 1989, the Marca is the name for the company, right? Dropped 3 more sizes. Okay, so and these are actually some of the more popular ones. So then they decided to make them a little fatter. They produced the Robustos. So the Robustos were about 5 inches by 50. Okay, then you have the Exquisitos, which were 5 by 33. It's like a petite Corona size. And then everyone's favorite, the Esplendido, which is 7 by 47. Pretty much we're talking a Churchill size. Okay, so now we have Cohiba pretty much producing these more traditional sizes as well. And these were the first 6 that were made by Cohiba, the first 6, and they were called the Linea Classica, okay, or the Classic line. All right, so these were the first original 6. So if you're going to talk about where did Cohiba start, these 6 are pretty much where it got started. Okay, now let's continue. After these sizes came out, it only took another 3 years for them to produce another 5 sizes. Okay, and this one was actually the Siglo 1 through 5, and they were released in 1992, and they were also known as the Linea 1492 because they were produced to commemorate Columbus coming to the Americas, okay? And everyone also knows the Siglos. But now, here's the interesting thing. This is only Siglo 1 through 5. The most popular Siglo, arguably, which is the Siglo 6, the fatty, the really fat one, that one actually came out in 2002. So that one was like an addition to the Linea Classica line. Now, this is actually where it gets a little bit interesting. When we're talking about the Siglos, right? So what happens is these came out at a really, really, really interesting time in the history of Cohiba. Why is that? Because this is in 1991, right? Zeno Davidoff, the guy who owns Davidoff, was actually making Cuban Davidoffs in Cuba for quite a while at this point, right? They came to him about 24 years earlier, right? And they were like, so for 24 years he's been working with Cuba to make Cuban Davidoffs. I actually own one of a Cuban Davidoff. Cost me $150. They're extremely hard to find, but they do exist, and supposedly they're amazing. But Zino Davidoff was extremely, extremely, extremely upset with the Cuban government. Okay, so what happened is they were apparently not producing the cigars at a good enough quality, right? Their quality control was going down the drain. Interestingly enough, the Davidoffs were also being produced in the La Guita line. So we have the Siglos that came out in 1992, and then in 1991, Davidoff decides to cut their shit off, right? And both cigars are made in the same factory, okay? So keep that in mind. Now, Zino Davidoff does not play around, okay? And what I mean by that is that it's no jokes with this guy, okay? What he did, and this is not a joke, he literally took 100,000 cigars and burned them in the streets. As a sign, it's kind of like his way of saying, our business is finished. Literally, that's what he did. And it kind of breaks my heart, but damn, what a statement. You know what I mean? Now, next year, the Siglos are made. So the theory goes as follows. Since Davidoff dropped Cuba, stopped making their cigars in Cuba, instead of just stopping producing Davidoff, obviously they couldn't produce Davidoff without Zino Davidoff. What they did is the next year they pumped out the Siglo line, which the sizes of the Siglo series 1 through 5, not really talking about 6 here, but Siglo 1 through 5 were actually very close, very similar sizes to the sizes of the Cuban Davidoffs that were created. So, you know, you can understand where I'm going with this. Pretty much they had to supplement the loss of all the Davidoffs with the Siglos. So if you smoke a Siglo, that would be the closest it would get to a Cuban Davidoff, because for all I know, they probably just used the same blend and just made a new line. You know, that's pretty much what it seems like. So really quickly, I do want to list off the 6 sizes of the Siglo. So we have the Siglo 1, which is a Petit Corona size. It's a 4x40. Then you have a Siglo 2, which is a 5x42, okay? The Siglo 3 is 6x42, so that's considered a long Corona size. Then you have the Siglo 4, that's 5 5/8 by 46, and that's called a Grand Corona, okay? Then, to finish it off, the Siglo 5 is 6 3/4 by 43, and that's your standard Lonsdale. And then, just want to remind you, in 2002, we got the Siglo 6, and that was about a 5 7/8, about 6 by 52, and that's called a Robusto Extra. So that's the really, really fat one, and obviously that one does carry the most, how do I say this? The most pizzazz with it. You know, everybody knows about it because it's such a big one, and it costs about $40. It's quite expensive. Okay, so at this point, I could probably spend 2 hours talking about special editions and limited editions. I will get to a couple later that I want to mention, you know, but there was a million and a half that came out. So many. I mean, you're talking about, like all types of sizes, like A's, Lanceros, like Figurados that came out. And there's no point. I would be here for an hour just listing off different sizes, different cigars. But I think what's worth mentioning is that in 2007, okay, they finally released another main production line cigar, meaning that it's not like a special edition or anything, and that was the Maduro 5 line. Okay, so the Maduro 5 line is actually one of, not the first, but one of the first few cigars that actually incorporated a Maduro wrapper. Now, if you guys are seasoned Cuban smokers, people who've smoked for a while, you can agree to this. Maduros are not really something that Cuba's ever delved into. It has a lot of things to do with, Cuban fermenting techniques. Just do not produce that dark of a wrapper. They do go pretty dark. You look at Bolivar wrappers, you could look at, Trinidad wrappers. They do have quite a nice oily sheen to them, but they never go as dark as, let's say, the Genios, the Magicos, and the Secretos, which is the names of the Maduro line, right? I guess this is a good time. Now, this I can't really tell you that I think this is true, but I have heard, on the down low, that not all of the Maduro wrappers that were used in Cuba come from Cuba. Some people say that they're outsourced. I don't know about that. I did, I had really long conversations with people about this, but all of it is just kind of like, I guess, what's the word, hearsay? I don't know. It's from word of mouth. I can't say that it's 100% true, but I kind of do believe it, because if you think about it, you have places like Florida, which are right off the coast of Cuba, and Florida has very similar, soil, very similar weather patterns as Cuba, so they can pretty much produce, Cuba-grade tobacco if you think about it with Cuban seeds. So, but that's just a theory. I don't want you guys to delve too deep into that. I might be completely wrong, and I'm okay with that. But like I said, it is something I heard. Now, no, the three Maduro 5 sizes were actually quite interesting. So you had the Secretos, which was really, really small, right? It's a petite Corona. It's only about 4 3/8 by 40. Small guy, maybe like a 20-minute smoke. Then you have the Magicos, which is a really like kind of smaller Robusto. That's 4.5 by 52. And then the Genios, which is the 5.5 by 52, which is that big fatty. And I gotta say, these out of all of the Cohibas, except like let's say the Bejiques, these are my favorite, just because it's really refreshing to have that Cuban complexity without having that, and also having that like dark, spicy, oily, burn to it as well. Because a lot of Cuban cigars, are actually like not that powerful, I would say. Obviously, you got your Trinidads and you got your Bolivars, which will knock you on your ass if you're not ready. But they don't ever have that like crazy amount of pepper and charcoal. And I find this Maduro 5 to be the perfect blend of flavor and a little bit of spice, which is really, really nice, right? So then I think it's worth mentioning that the next main production line. Now, the only reason I'm calling this a main production line is they do keep producing these. So we're going to talk about the Bejiques. Now, I'm going to have to talk a little bit about what we talked about with I Post Alone last week. But I think it's worth mentioning because I don't want to leave this gap in the history, okay? So then we have the Bejiques. The first Bejiques came out in 2006, okay? They came in 40 boxes of 100, okay? And every single one was rolled by the same woman named Norma. The thing about this cigar that was super special is that it used really, really aged tobacco and supposedly had a leaf in it that was called the Medio Tempo leaf, which, so to explain the Medio Tempo, I guess I'll have to go into the structure of a leaf. The bottom of a plant, you have pretty much like the lighter leaves, the velados, right? Then you go to the middle, you have the secos and the visos, which are like in the middle. They get the medium amount of sunlight, so they're, not too oily, but oilier than the velados at the bottom. Then you have on top of that, you have like, the ligeros, the darker tobaccos, right? It's the leaves all the way at the top, so they get the most sunlight and they produce the most oil, so the most flavor, right? And then on top of that, you have something called the Medio Tempo, which is just a couple of leaves right at the crown of the plant, and those are the leaves that they use inside of the Bejiques. Right. So when the interesting thing about this is that the Medio Tempo is actually sometimes also considered the super ligero. So you can imagine how much flavor it packs. So the first Bejiques that came out actually, I think, did not have the Medio Tempo in them. They were just really, really well-aged tobacco. They were all rolled by the same person. I think, a box of them right now in 2019 goes for about $265,000 for 100 cigars. So, that's just to put into perspective for you. Now, that's in 2006. In 2007, that's when they decided to release them for mass production, right? So 2006 is the first release, limited edition, 40 boxes of 100, and then in 2007, they just started pumping them out. Now, they had three sizes, right? When we're talking about the Bejiques, there's three specific sizes that are worth mentioning, okay? You have the Bejique 52, the Bejique 54, and the Bejique 56. The 52 is a 4 by 5/8 by 52, so that's a petite robusto size. Then you have the Bejique 54, which is a 5 5/8 by 54, so that's the robusto extra. And then the Bejique 56, which is everyone's favorite, which is 6.5 by 56, so that's a double robusto. Think of like a slightly shorter Churchill, but a bit fatter. So that's the most popular size. Now, in my opinion, the Bejiques are probably some of the best Cubans you can get. They are a bit expensive. But also I want you guys to keep in mind that they're some of the most faked cigars on the planet Earth. And unfortunately, they are actually faked really, 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 really well. And there's only a couple things I could tell you for certain to know if they're fake. So one thing I do want to mention is Bejiques will only come out in boxes of 10. There were releases where they came out in 25 jars, but trust me, I don't give a shit who you are. You're not getting those. So if you do see them for sale, you'll know that they're pretty much fake. Another thing is that when you do get a box of Bejiques, right, on the box, two things are pretty much supposed to happen. You're supposed to have a code, right, on the box, on the sticker, the Cuba sticker, and you can actually put that code into the La Casa de Habanos website, and it'll tell you if they're legit or not. So that's another way of telling you. Now, as far as, yes, do they take boxes and could they put other Bejiques in there? Absolutely, yeah, it's definitely possible. But you always have to be really careful. I have personally been fooled by this. I've actually, said that Bejiques were real till only later find out that they were fake. I'm guilty of it, and I always considered myself somebody who's very careful when it comes to this. So the fakes are only getting better. I hear people that say that they can get Bejiques for about $45 a piece in Cuba. I don't know about that, and I'll tell you why. Because when you're talking about Cuba, if you walk through the factory, it's much different. First of all, if you want to, just to give you an example, if you want to take a factory tour of the Laguita factory, they do it. It's a beautiful mansion. I mean, why not? But as far as going into where the rollers are, only very few journalists are even allowed into this room. And as opposed to other factories where you can literally just grab a stick right off the table and nobody will tell you nothing, when you leave, you just kind of get like an exquisito and that's it, and you cannot touch anything, right? So just to show you how important Cohiba is, even the fields that the Cohiba factory is produced in are absolute mysteries. We'll get into that a bit later after I go over all the lines, right? But they don't even let you know where the fields are, and that's to show you how secretive it is. So as far as the Bejiques go, there's no way you're getting a $35 Bejique just because you're in Cuba. Yes, you may know somebody, but all I'm saying is when I hear guys that get $35 Bejiques, they're always fake. I've never seen a guy who gets $35 Bejiques and they're actually legit. Just saying my thing. Just want to make sure you guys understand. So Bejiques normally go, depending on the size, they go between 80 and like 110, 120 bucks. The 52s are about 80 bucks, so that's like 800 for a box of 10, and then the 56s are about 120 bucks, 1,200 for a box of 10, approximately. I might be off, but that's what they kind of float around for. And those are, Cohiba was already a really, really famous company. You know what I mean? But they pretty much blew up when the Bejique was released. Everybody was dying to get their hands on it. If you guys listen to what Post yesterday, couldn't stop salivating on the table. He was so excited by them. You know what I mean? So just want to reiterate. So the first Bejiques came out as limited editions in 2006, and then in 2010 they were pumped out as actually like a mass production line. I might have said it was 2007. I'm sorry about that. That's not right. So in 2010 is when the Bejiques came out. Now, one other thing I want to mention about the Bejiques before we move on is that they were actually so in the factory they're not called Bejiques. They're actually called Laguita 4, 5, and 6. So if you remember, Laguita 1, 2, and 3 was actually the first 3 Cubans that Cohiba was making. The first 3 cigars that the Cohiba company was making. And these are considered the 4, 5, and 6. So these are like the spiritual successor of the Laguita 1, 2, and 3. You know what I mean? So the pretty much what they're trying to say is, this is how we used to do it. This is how we're doing it now. You know what I mean? Like, it's a little throwback to the cigars in the past. Now, that's pretty much it as far as mass production lines go, the most popular ones. There are, though, a couple of cigars that I think are worth mentioning because they are mass production, but they don't fall into any one of these releases. So the first one I want to mention is the Pyramides Extra. It's the kind of like the torpedo. It's big ass stick, and it came out in 2012, and it's a 6 1/4 by 54. And now I've argued with people about this, but I think that they have a slightly darker wrapper. They seem to have maybe not a Maduro, but like a Sangre. I don't know. Whenever I have one of these Pyramides Extras, and mind you, I only had one, but I've seen a couple, they always have this nice dark sheen to them that other Cohibas just don't have. It's very strange. I can't explain it. People tell me that they're not Maduros, but I could swear they're Maduros. And so this one came out in 2012, and it's like I said, it's not part of any official release, but they have been steadily pumping them out. So again, I did think it was worth a mention. Another size that is worth mentioning actually is the Medio Siglo size, and it's another one of those that they didn't really come out in any release, right? But they just kind of its own size that they kept pumping out, and that one's a short fatty, right? So that's 4 by 52. It's quite popular. They're really nice because they burn for about 45 minutes. You get really, really great smoke production, and they're quick, and they're usually pretty cost effective. Like you could get those probably if you get a box 25 for like 12 to 15 bucks a piece, depending on the source. And for Cohiba, that's actually quite reasonable. So I think it was a good move. You know what I mean? Because some people do want to try Cohiba, but they're not particularly fans of Panatellas or Lanceros or Exquisitos, which are fairly thin cigars. So, but they also don't want to throw out $30 per cigar for something fatter, which usually that's the way Cuba works, right? A lot of their sizes are quite thin, so when they do go fat, they usually add a nice price tag to it. The Subaran, the limited edition Bolivars, the Trinidads, all those fatties, they're usually quite expensive. So that's about it as far as the main production stuff, right? So the stuff that's quite easily attainable. You'll probably see it in every store overseas. I'm in the U.S., so I'm talking about everywhere else where they do sell Cubans. It's not it's nothing crazy. Now I do want to talk about a couple of Cohibas now that are small batch, that are like limited edition, kind of like the original Bejiques that I spoke about. They just, I guess the only way to explain it is they tickled my fancy. I thought that they were worth mentioning. So some of these, like Cohiba, what they like to do is they like to make small batches of as little as 50 cigars. You know what I mean? So like there's some cigars out there that you're probably not going to get anywhere else, right? Like you get a batch of it and that's it. You can get be the only person to have these Cohibas made specifically for you. Like I think one of the rarest ones I've ever seen was a special Cohiba that was the Uday Hussein edition. You know what I mean? So it was a special Cohiba just made by Uday Hussein. The cigar's probably priceless. I've seen one. You know what I mean? So they've made tons and tons and tons of these like really small batch cigars. But so I can spend like an hour telling you about all of them, and you can find all of them on CubanCigarWebsite.com. I think that's what it is. Or CubanCigars.com. I gotta look it up, but it's this website where they pretty much tell you the whole history of the whole thing, right? So the ones that I think are worth mentioning actually are the limited editions, right? So those are pretty much they started in 2001, and what they do is they every year, right? The Habanos produces a line of limited editions. It's usually 3 cigars, and it's a unique size, right? And it's made specifically for that year. So Cohiba did have one that came out in 2001, and the last one that came out was in 2017. And in between those years, they have produced 7 different Cohiba limited editions. Now, the limited editions are quite nice. It's some of the better aged tobacco. I would say, Cubans have an issue, and one of the issues with Cubans is that they do tend to plug very easily. If you ever... if money's not really your problem, the limited editions are the way to go because that uses some of the best trussadores, the rollers from Cuba, to roll those cigars because those are worth a pretty penny. Like, I think a Cohiba limited edition, some of them could go for like a ton of money. For instance, the last limited edition that came out for Cohiba came out in 2017, and that was called the Talisman. And the Talisman is kind of like the unofficial Maduro. That one, I'll fight you. That cigar definitely has a darker wrapper. I don't give a shit what you say. And it's a nice and fat. They really, really, really made a monster smoke. I don't have the exact dimensions in front of me, but what I do know is that they are definitely not small. The 2001, the first one that came out was actually the first, not the first, but was actually a pyramide size. So they went from a pyramide size in 2001, and then the latest one in 2017 was the fatties. So now that we got that out of the way, I do want to discuss just a couple more. Now, everybody is familiar, I mean, at least if you know your cigars, with the A size, right? Cohiba did produce a A size several times, but one of the most, I guess, one of the most sought after A's actually came out for the 35-year anniversary of the Cohiba brand. Okay, and they're 9 1/4 inches by 47. So think of like a really, 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 really long Churchill. These cigars are quite priceless. Some of them do exist. A lot of them are actually in Asia, in China. In China, it's actually really, really, really popular to buy these cigars and age the shit out of them. They have a culture of aging the cigars. I find way more than here in the U.S. and in Europe. Every single Chinese Instagram account that I follow is always posting this crazy stuff. And actually, one of the accounts is I can't even tell you what it is because the name is in Chinese, but he's always posting these crazy like age stuff, you know. And one of the things he posted was this Cohiba A. So I decided to do some research on it, and the more I kept reading about it, the more I kept salivating. You know what I mean? So this is something that they only produce very, 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 very rarely. Okay, so one more that I want to mention, and this is the final cigar that I want to mention specifically. Okay, came out in 2016, and as opposed to being a 35-year anniversary cigar, this was to mark the 50th anniversary of the Cohiba Company. Okay, so to make this is really, really, really special, and I'll tell you why. So for the 50th anniversary, Cohiba did something that they've never done before. So just to preface real quick, let's say you're in Cuba. If you want to get a 60 ring gauge cigar, the only way that you're probably going to get your hands on a 60 ring gauge cigar is if you go to a blender or somebody, like a hotel. Sometimes they have rollers, or La Casa de Habano stores. Sometimes they have rollers there, and what they'll do is they'll roll you a 60 ring gauge right away, right in front of you. But if you get any like main production cigars that are 60 ring gauge, it's just not going to happen. Right? They don't exist. But in 2016 was the first time that Cohiba actually produced a cigar that had a 60 ring gauge. So this is called the Grandiosos, and it's for like I said, the 50th anniversary of Cohiba. So they made one that was 7 by 60 inches, and it came only in a box of 50, and only 50 boxes were made. You can do the math real quick on that. As far as how much they're worth, it's tough to say. These cigars came in like these really beautiful humidors, and they were auctioned off during the Habanos festival that year. So it's those auctions, they don't particularly release the prices all the time, and it's always tough to get like a real concrete price. But you're thinking, probably maybe $100,000 for 50 cigars. This tobacco is apparently aged for like numerous years, way longer than regular Cuban tobacco, and of course 60 ring gauge, which again didn't exist officially until this cigar came out, and that was just 2016. That was 3 years ago. I don't even know if they produced any other 60s after that, but again, 2016 was the first year, so I thought that was really great. Now that we're done with that, that's pretty much my little history of the production lines that Cohiba had. Again, I didn't mention all of it. If you actually sit there and take a look at all the special editions that came out, it will just blow your mind. But this is pretty much the main production ones and a couple of honorable mentions towards the end. So now I think would be a good time to discuss the tobacco, the Cohiba tobacco itself, okay? Because I think there's a lot of really important stuff to discuss there. Okay, so when we're talking about Cuba and what makes Cuban tobacco special, I bring up a lot the 3 S's: sun, soil, seed. So let's start with, I guess, sun, right? So the Cuban weather, is pretty much uniform throughout the whole island, so there's really not much to discuss there. But then we get to the other two, the soil, the seed. So as far as soil goes, the tobacco that's grown is grown in actually a place called Vuelta Abajo. It's actually a region where some of the finest Cuban tobacco is grown. I would say that it probably takes most of the attention, most of the resources to maintain. Some of the finer Cuban cigars, tobaccos produced there, Cohibas, Trinidads, Quai d'Orsay, all those tobaccos actually come from the Vuelta Abajo, okay, and that's really what does the trick. You know what I mean? Does the trick for the Cohiba tobacco. Now, another thing that they do that's really interesting is Cohiba actually has a third level of fermentation, and what they do is they take the tobacco and they give it a third round of barrel fermentation. Okay, and the reason that that's really important is because they pretty much they give it a little bit more. When you ferment the tobacco in barrels, what happens is the tobacco gains a lot of the flavor of the wood, but also it produces a lot of extra oil. The tobacco gets a little bit more flavorful and a little bit more complex. So that's why this third stage of barrel fermenting is so important. Okay, now that we're back, now we're talking about the Volta Bajo region. I do want to make it very clear. It's pretty much a guarded secret what actual tobacco fields are used for the Cohiba tobacco. You can look at a map and you can see the fields, but you won't know exactly which ones are for Cohiba. And when we're talking about the quality of the Cohiba tobacco, I think it's very important to mention this one really crazy statistic. So in 1992, what we know a couple of numbers. So we know that there was a total of 10 farms that were actively growing tobacco for the Cohiba Marca. Okay, the 10 fields totaled amassed a total of 700 acres. Okay, now what's really cool about that is, due to the high level of quality that Cohiba demanded for their tobacco, they only used half of those fields. So out of 700 acres, we're looking at only 350 acres of tobacco that were used for Cohiba, and the rest were repurposed in other cigar companies, or other cigar brands, whatever. They figured out what to do with it. Maybe they were used for Cohiba cigarillos, but like I said, those were the only ones that were used, and they literally had to just dead half of the fields. You know what I mean? And I find that really crazy. Imagine you plant 10 fields and then you can only use 5 of them. People do complain a lot about Cuban quality control, and for good reason. But I find that it's quite amazing that they were actually able to, willing to do that. Let me explain real quick, just to make you understand. Here's the problem. I think we discussed this with Post last week as well, but I do want to reiterate. So, the Cuban market pretty much produces cigars for the rest of the world, right? They don't sell to America, but they do sell to the rest of the planet. And cigar smoking has become extremely popular over the last 30 years. It's increased tremendously, right? So when you have this the demand, the supply needs to be produced, and when you have to produce more and more and more and more cigars, what happens is the quality goes down. So even though the popularity of cigars has gone up over the last 30 years, the quality of Cuban cigars has gone down. And anybody that regularly smokes Cuban cigars will tell you that one is actually being too generous. 2 or 3 out of every 10 cigars is probably going to have a shitty pull. And that sounds a bit generous. I've had boxes of Cubans where half of them didn't pull, and I guarantee you they were 100% real. One of the things that I say is that if you really want to know if your Cubans are real, you'll know if they pull like shit, right? Because that's one of the biggest tells to whether a cigar is actually Cuban or not. That being said, the fact that they're willing to sacrifice half of the tobacco, even though the quality is going down, it just shows you how serious they take the Cohiba Marca and how important it is, not just for the money that they make, but it's an image thing. It's a class thing. Cohiba is known worldwide, so they always have to make sure that they take the extra effort, and that's why I think if you do want to have a foray into Cuban tobacco, I do think that Cohiba is a really good place to start, just for the simple fact that I really, really rarely get a plugged one, especially if it's a Siglo 6. I've never had a plugged Siglo 6. As far as the Lanceros and the Panatellas, sometimes you do get a plugged one, but that's because thinner cigars get plugged a bit easier than others. I think that's really important and worth mentioning, just for the simple fact that that when people ask why Cohiba is so famous, you point towards several things. So first, what we discussed is the history, right? Cohiba was literally started by Castro himself. It was originally started to be the company that produces cigars for him and his friends, right? That alone gives it a kind of an air, a mystique, right? One of the most famous cigar smokers in the world, his personal cigar, right? So there's that. On top of that, it's the way that they decided to market it over the years, right? They could have just easily started pumping them out, saying, "Hey, Fidel Castro cigar," but instead, what they decided to do is they decided to say, "Hey, we're going to hold back, and what we're going to do is we're going to give it out to only certain special dignitaries, right? So let's say in the 60s and 70s you hear of Cohiba, but you see for French president or the Bosnian president smoking one, or Fidel Castro, and a Russian diplomat smoking one, whatever. And people are like, oh, what is that? Oh, Cohiba. Oh, what is Cohiba? You know what I mean? It's like that's the kind of mystique that it adds. It's almost like, the Dom Perignon or whatever. Like, I don't know my alcohol at all, but let's say like the champagne that all the rappers drink. It's kind of like it's what everybody idolizes. So that's kind of like the kind of power that the Cohiba brand had. And then when they decided to push them out and produce them, they charged a pretty penny for them, and people were willing to pay out of the ass because they were like, hey, I want to try that cigar that, that the French president smokes, or I want to try that cigar that Fidel smokes, So it really did create a lot of hype, and it's funny because a lot of people aren't even aware that Fidel stopped smoking in like the late 80s due to health concerns. So the Cohibas were mass produced in around the same time. So it is quite a coincidence. Now I think a really important thing that I wanted to mention about Cohiba, and since we did bring up the like how Cohiba tobacco has gone, not Cohiba but Cuban tobacco has kind of went downhill a little bit, is this exodus. So what happened is, once the Communist Party took over, they nationalized all the major cigar brands. Remember, Cohiba wasn't around at this point. But what happened is a lot of rollers and farmers left Cuba to go to places like DR, Nicaragua, and that's usually when you're talking about the history of a cigar company. It's usually you have Cuba, and then there's like a web of people spreading out from Cuba, going all over the region to produce tobacco in other countries and stuff. And I think that's really important to bring up, because this is why we have a Cohiba in America and a Cohiba in Cuba. Now this gets really confusing, and I want to address it really quickly. So what happened is you have this exodus, right? So you have all these rollers, you have all these blenders leaving, going to places like the DR, going to places like Nicaragua, Honduras, I guess in Florida. Nah, I don't forget Florida, not Florida, but they spread out all across South America and Central America, and even Mexico actually. And what they did is they started producing all this tobacco in all these other countries. Funny enough, even one of the main rollers one of the main guys that ran the Laguita factory actually left, and he moved to the Grey Cliff Hotel, which I believe is in the Bahamas, and started rolling cigars there for them. You know what I mean? So they definitely really did spread out a lot. And now this is so then you have the formation of the Dominican based Cohiba company, right? And obviously there's been a ton of like lawsuits going back and forth between the Cuban Cohiba and the Dominican Cohiba, and it does ask, you got to ask the question, how is this allowed to exist? Well, it's simple. Since America has this embargo on Cuba, it's very, very difficult for Cubans to actually sue the shit out of the American Cohiba. It's very difficult. A lot of these cases are still ongoing, and they've been ongoing for many, many years now. Now, the Cuban Cohiba, I want to say, is owned by a company called General Cigars. And remember, General also owns Hoyo de Monterrey, Partagas, La Gloria Cubana. These are all cigars that were produced in Cuba originally, right? And because of this exodus, because of all these people leaving Cuba, is why this kind of happened, right? Because let's say you make the Monte Cristo cigar, right, and then you leave Cuba, you'll keep the name because it's a famous name. Why wouldn't you, right? And you would produce Monte Cristo cigars in the Dominican Republic. It's like free marketing. So, and that's kind of why there's allowed to be this kind of coexistence. Now, if you notice, if you travel outside of the U.S., if you travel to anywhere, like I said, anywhere outside the U.S., Canada, Europe, Asia, South America, what you'll notice is you don't have any of these Dominican Monte Cristos or these Dominican Partagas, for the simple reason that you're only allowed to pretty much sell them in the U.S. because that's the only place where the Cuban government can't sue your ass, right? So that's why if you look everywhere else across the whole, world, it's Cubans, and then here in the U.S., it's Dominicans and Nicaraguans. That's a simple reason, is because, there's no lawsuits. Now, for instance, if you go overseas, like one of my favorite companies, Drew Estate, right now they're actually pushing to sell overseas. They have Drew Estate International, and I think that's all cool, because they're a new company. They have no ties to Cuba at all. And that's why they're able to do this. Fuente is the same thing. That's why you see guys overseas smoking opuses and shit. Simple fact that Fuente, even though they do have roots in Cuba, they are an original company. They have no ties to the Cuban at all. There's no Cuban alternative to Fuente. There's no Arturo Fuente Cuba, right? So that's another thing that I think is worth mentioning. So this is why you have this really interesting situation. It's funny, a lot of people don't tend to realize that this is happening until I bring it up, and they're like, "Oh, I never noticed that." Because I guess if, let's say you're an American, you're a cigar smoker and you're smoking the Dominican Cohiba or the Nicaraguan Cohiba, right? And it's a good stuff. Like the Cohiba Red Dot Black by General Cigar is one of my favorites. It's very, very delicious. They're dark as hell. Like I'm talking about like Oscuro dark, like really, really oily, really, really dark. And then when you go overseas, you're not looking for that, right? You're looking, okay, if I'm gonna have a Cohiba, I'm gonna have goddamn Esplendido. So you start looking for Esplendidos, and it doesn't really occur to you like, oh, how come there's none of these Red Dot Blacks around? And that's why, because they do not sell the Dominican and Nicaraguans overseas, only in the United States. And I think that's absolutely crazy and a little confusing. And also, again, if the embargo lifts for some reason and they're allowed to sell Cuban cigars here in the States, it'll be really, really crazy to see what happens. There's probably going to be lawsuits galore. I don't know. I'm guessing it's going to be Cohiba and then Cohiba USA or something like that. Oh, excuse me. But that's just a guess. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but it is quite an interesting predicament, I would say. So yeah, that's another little smidgen of history about the Cohiba company. It's quite an interesting brand. I mean, once you factor everything in, it is quite obvious why it is where it is. The special care they take with their tobacco, the marketing. I know I'm repeating myself, but this is the part of the show where I just do the roundup. So I just want to let you guys know exactly what's going on. Now let's talk about just to round it up. I want to talk about my personal opinions about the company and about the cigars in general. Some of them are extremely expensive, and the question always becomes, are they worth it? I know guys that will happily pay $100 for a Behike. I have several Behikes, and that's how much I paid for them, actually a bit more. And and I don't really make that much money. Usually the guys that are smoking Behikes every day are making dough, because you get, it's a box, $800 for a box of 10 is not cheap. And let's say you smoke one cigar a day, $80 a day. It makes cigarette smokers look like nothing, right? Is it worth it? That's really the main question. I definitely think that any cigar smoker that I don't want to say takes themselves seriously, but really wants to explore the Cuban tobacco and try to understand why people are. It's worth a try. It definitely is worth a try. But I think it's also important to come into it really knowing what you're smoking, right? Because a lot of people just hear the name and they get excited, but they don't really know what makes it special, why it costs this much. They just think, because they produce so little of them, but lo and behold, there's a reason there's so few of them, because of this Medio Tempo leaf, right? It is, there's people that swear by it, but again, Cohiba does have their haters, and to be honest, it's really interesting with me, because I used to be not the biggest fan of Cohibas. I don't know if that has something to do with the fact that I didn't know how to tell fakes before, and maybe I smoked a bunch of fake ones, but I do know that I was never a huge fan. People would give them to me, I would trade them, I would buy them, and I was never too excited to smoke them. They would always have, I guess, too much harshness for me. Now, as my palate has changed, I did realize that, I do enjoy harsher cigars, so that might have something to do with it. But some people who are fans of lighter cigars that don't really have too much, palate destruction going on, they will probably not, they'll probably not be super big fans of it. Also, novice smokers, right? Novice new smokers, they probably won't enjoy it too much either, because to them, they won't really be able to tell the difference. Like if you talk to a novice smoker and you ask them, hey, what do you think of this cigar? They'll either tell you it's smooth or it's strong. They won't tell you what exactly they like about it or what they don't like about it. They only have pretty much on or off. I like it or I don't. So I feel like if you're not gonna sit there and actually meditate on what the cigar tastes like and what it means, you may be a little underwhelmed because you'll think, okay, I'm paying $100 for this cigar. Is it really is it worth it all that, right? And then you'll think like, oh, well, I could pay like $30 and get a nice Padrona and probably enjoy it just as much. So again, the question becomes, is it worth it? And I guess the answer is it depends. It depends. Would I buy more Behikes right now? Hell no. Why? Because I have a couple. I'm happy with them. I'm aging the shit out of them. I'm not going to touch them. Now, also, that's actually a good point. If you guys do get Behikes, right, and it's a good source, La Casa de Habanos, or you can go to I Havanas. I Havanas also has legit Behikes. They look beautiful. I Post Alone just put up a couple of pictures on his Instagram. They look great. Beauties. And those are 100% legit, right? So if you do decide to get that, I do suggest you let them sit for maybe a year. I know that's a bit much. But even though these cigars have been aged for quite a while, a year inside of like a humidor will definitely do them a lot of good. So that's the Behikes. So again, you're going to spend $100 on a Behike? Make sure that you're not just doing it because of the name. Make sure you're doing it because you really do appreciate the tobacco, because then it'll definitely be worth it. Now, as far as the regular lines, I think that they're also worth a try. Again, they could be a little bit underwhelming to people that don't quite have a taste for them. Those people do exist. It's the same as like the Dominican Arturo Fuente Opuses. There's people that love the Opuses, and there's people that don't find anything interesting about them. And it's funny because the Opus had the same curve for me as did the Cohibas, right? So first I was kind of underwhelmed by Opus. Like I would buy them and smoke them. And I would think it's like, I don't know, what the fuck, like I don't know what's going on. Like I'm not that big of a fan. But then more recently, I mean, my Opus collection is really dwindling because I keep smoking them. You know what I mean? So what I will say is, it's definitely a cigar for somebody that likes something more medium to full. Towards the end, it does a little bit of pepper come up. I know a lot of people don't drink, so if it's definitely a cigar that should be enjoyed with some whiskey. But if you don't drink whiskey, that's fine. I think a nice black coffee, slightly sweetened, would work as well, even with a little bit of milk, whatever your taste is. But definitely have something to drink with this cigar, because if you do not kind of give your palate a little break, a little rest, a little cleanse, you will find it to be a little daunting, especially towards the end. People who aren't fans of pepper will find that, right? But also, like, when you take a sip of that coffee or a little bit of that whiskey, and then you take a puff of that Cohiba, it's oh man, the flavors that you get sometimes blow my mind, like a leathery, sweet nuttiness. Honestly, the thing about Cohibas is I feel like they hit every single note just perfectly. That really is. I know I sound like a huge fanboy. I guess I am. But, I can't lie. I can't lie to you guys. I do really love Cohiba. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. That was my little rant, my little 1 hour, 50 minutes, whatever it is, talk about Cohiba. Hopefully, I covered a lot of things that you guys wanted to know about. I know that I stumbled through a couple of things. It was a bit difficult because I was expecting to do this as not live. I was expecting to do this as like a video. I was going to edit it, and I actually started recording some of the lines for this video, but I realized I hated all of them, and then I thought, shit, I'll just do it live today. So that's my roundup of the Cohiba Company. I hope you guys enjoyed. Again, this is Artie the Cigar Guy. You guys can find me on Instagram and YouTube at Ashhole NYC. That's ASHHOLENYC. Please check it out. I have videos that I put up on YouTube, reviews, and a bunch of great content on Instagram, a lot of educational stuff. And if you want to learn about fake Cubans, jump on my Instagram, because I post tons of fake Cubans and real Cubans just to show you side-by-side comparisons. So if you are really interested in learning about that, please go on my Instagram. You will not regret it, okay? Thank you so much, New York. Thank you so much, the world. Once again, this is Artie the Cigar Guy on Smoke Signals here on City World Radio, and good night.